I'll be doing today's presentation on the end of Moore's Law. Um, Outline for this presentation, I'll briefly define what Moore's Law is. If you don't know what it is, I'll describe why it's important and the meaning behind this prediction. I'll answer the question at hand very shortly, is Moore's Law coming to an end? And then I'll kind of spend most of this presentation going into meaningful technical detail on some counter arguments, some solutions about how to extend Moore's Law. Most of the important stuff is going to be in that portion. So what is Moore's Law exactly? It is a prediction, not a law. It says that the number of transistors will double in an integrated circuit about every 2 years. Some people say 18 months, but 2 years is the going model. Big idea here is that the processors get about twice as fast every 2 years. I included this little graphic on the right-hand side. You can see if you go on the z-axis, you have the number of transistors. The x-axis, you have the processing power, like the raw processing power. And on the y-axis, you have different processors going by year, give or take about every 2 years. If you go all the way from 1971 down to the year 2000, you have about a doubling of speed. So you can kind of see, you have a lot of Intel chips at the bottom there. Then as you go up, you have some more primitive examples, but hopefully that kind of drives some of the point a little bit. You double the speed of a processor about every 2 years from the doubling of number of transistors in every circuit. And if this is observed and coined by Gordon Moore. Moving on, why is it so important? Why are people so concerned with it? Because of its accuracy, it's viewed as a reliable method of calculating future trends and setting the pace of innovation in the industry. On a similar note, as a result of the explosive growth and innovation, an estimated 3 trillion of value has been added to the global GDP between 1995 and 2005. And to put this all in perspective, if the doubling of transistors only occurred every 3 years instead of every 2 years, it's estimated that technology would have only advanced to a level that we had in the year 1998 in the year 2015. So even if this doubling, if this exponential slowed to every 3 years as opposed to every 2 years, we would be pretty far behind by today's standards. So it's in our best interest as a society to keep Moore's Law going. So the big question, right? Has Moore's Law come to an end? Relatively soon, it's most likely going to. It's predicted in the next few years. I saw 2025 a lot in different academic articles. But again, that is an easy answer that everyone just kind of knows. It doesn't really tell us like the whole story. If you Google, Moore's Law, you'll kind of find that answer anywhere you look. And one final thing on this, answering the big question here at this moment, is that despite much speculation and opinion on the subject, no one can say exactly when the era of Moore's Law will come to a close. A lot of predictions out there, obviously, but there's no like one concrete answer to that question as of yet. So moving on. One thing I'll say is that Moore's Law is a fluid concept. So for example, the original prediction didn't really control for newer developments in the area, such as Thenard scaling or Amdahl's law. Thenard scaling have to do with the reduction of required power for each transistor, which kind of pushed Moore's Law forward. Amdahl's law, not an expert, but I believe that's like the increased efficiency of like making subroutines a little bit faster at the architecture level. Don't have that perfect, but it's a very important development in computer architecture that provided much more growth to Moore's Law. And on a very similar token, Moore's Law is heavily tied to advancements in computer architecture, and it's believed that more breakthroughs are needed to happen to keep this exponential going. Kind of an obvious point, but Moore's Law isn't like a thing by itself. It's very tied to other things within the industry. And even a good example, Gordon Moore himself revised his observation in 1975, and he argued that 3 general trends is what's going to lead to the doubling of components. Pretty important stuff here I'll get into in a minute, but a little preview is going to be decreasing the component size, increasing the chip area, and reducing the unused area between transistors. Now, we can avoid the end of Moore's Law, theoretically speaking. There are a few technologies out there that can potentially facilitate the exponential increase in computational power promised by Moore's Law, kind of what I said a little bit earlier. Now, these new design directions are by no means guaranteed, but some of them do provide a pretty positive outlook on the future. And kind of a side note I'll mention, I found this pretty interesting, but a lot of the performance increases we can achieve in today's world are kind of limited by overheating. So oftentimes, from what I've heard, processors often have to slow themselves down, turn on some cores, because there's just so much like excess heat generated by the processor that we don't really have a way to cool it down, to optimize cooling as much as we would like. And here I'll kind of get into some more practical terms, describing the physical limits to Moore's law. Obviously, on a similar note from what I mentioned a second ago, we have thermal limits. So processor chips can typically handle up to 400 Kelvin, but there is a constant balancing act of trying to increase the power of the chip while trying to keep it as cool as possible. The required power for powering a chip, less than a nanometer, features on a chip less than a nanometer is ridiculously high. It's a very, cost non-effective way of, powering the chip. And going a little bit further, I guess cooling is a means to an end. It can take away from the performance in some cases. And the reason why clock speeds are limited to 4 gigahertz is because they are so constrained by thermals in a lot of cases. And going a little bit further, we also have thermodynamic limits. And to perform, this is more about just energy required in general to kind of boot up a processor to make it work, to make it go. To perform useful computation, there has to be like an irreversible change of distinguishable state in memory. That's kind of how computation works at a pretty basic level. As far as the power required to do that, you need about 0.017 electron volts of energy to process it at 300 Kelvin, according to Shannon von Neumann's Landauer expression. And that's going to be basically the power required to process 1 bit, or the energy required to process 1 bit. And that's going to be the Boltzmann constant times the time value times natural log times 2. Just the most basic, equation for processing a single bit of data. That's another constraint on Moore's law. Another point I'll mention is that there's something called a Compton wavelength. It's proposed as the absolute limit of the size of an electronic device. It's the characteristic dimension of an electron, and that's like the absolute smallest you could possibly make a computational unit. And if you're curious, the wavelength of that's going to be 0.00243 nanometers. And all that said, we're likely going to hit these physical limits within the next 30 to 40 years. However, this doesn't account for newer kinds of technologies that could innovate creatively in this area. And then I'll kind of go into that in the next slide. One proposed solution is going to be a 3D chip. I thought this is pretty cool. Basically, newer chips with higher performance can be built, move into a 3D architecture, and you kind of have like this layered model where you have like layers of logic, memory being, either quick access, fast, a little bit slower, for massive storage kind of a thing. 3D manufacturing enables the number of transistors per chip to continue rising without requiring unrealistically small feature sizes. So pretty cool thing there. There's just one solution. There's also a more software-centric approach to continuing Moore's law, especially with newer architectures. It could allow for faster speeds via rewrite to the existing code for the chip. A large performance gain can be achieved by having specialist programmers write highly optimized subroutines for components using the new architectures. So you could have, specialist coders kind of going into writing, very specialized code for the chip to hopefully get performance increases that would allow the continuation of Moore's law going into the future. And on a related note, I saw this online. I thought it was pretty cool. There's a movement towards domain-specific architectures with specialized instruction sets that can provide drastic performance upgrades. The problem is that it's going to require a lot of overhead for design and programming, although it is a possible solution out there. Okay. Some criticisms of some proposed solutions that are out there, some popular solutions. There's a lot of non-silicon material-based approaches, so carbon nanotubes and superconductivity. These two things still face theoretical limits, only slightly better than that of silicon. Despite a huge research effort, carbon nanotubes have not yet found a real application, partly due to the difficulty in controlling their exact morphology reliably in a reproducible way. Graphene, still a carbon-based material. It's a 2D hexagonal grid of carbon atoms, if you didn't know. It's popular in use for transistors, sensors, electrodes, etc. Its reliability and design are still of major concern. It's still early days yet, though. Its market impact is also uncertain, although its academic and industrial support is still pretty strong. A really optimistic note I'll make is that frequencies as high as 15 gigahertz have been reached with carbon nanotube field effect transistors. So it's not all bad news, obviously. And if you get clock speeds at 15 gigahertz, that's a much higher improvement versus what we have today with about, the limit of 4 gigahertz. So possibly a solution for the future, but, still got, plenty of ways to go in that area for graphene. Another kind of computation I saw in a paper was about molecular electronics. It's basically the idea that single conductive molecules can be used for computation. They could possibly be used for non-volatile memories, diodes, or switches, and the computation is basically like 1 bit per molecule. This is a pretty cool primitive technology, but it's not yet fully understood yet. And there's another thing about metallic leads, and its role isn't really clear, and it can have parasitic effects due to the surrounding environment. And kind of another piece of the puzzle that we haven't really solved yet for molecular electronics. And so I found a pretty big idea for a new form of computation that could possibly extend Moore's law. It's kind of a long shot, but if we do kind of fully realize it, it is going to provide a huge performance increase for many decades to come. And I saw it in a few different research papers, so I think it's worth mentioning here. So, it's called biological computation. It's pretty related to molecular electronic theory, and this particular technology provides a possible other alternative to complementary metal oxide semiconductors. If this method of computation matures, it could provide, like I was saying before, it could extend Moore's law. I'll kind of describe it here a little bit. Biological computation. The idea is that you have a normal biological cell for information processing, mostly through its own pre-existing facilities. So with things like cell reproduction, extracellular communication, processing information from external stimuli, you have like a method of controlling or processing information that's at a much smaller scale, and it's facilitated by something very natural for like a normal animal cell, plant cell, whatever. And one thing that's kind of cool about this is we can actually compare it to a computer in a lot of ways. So it has long-term memory, which would be represented by the DNA molecule inside of the cell. And its logical units, processing units, and short-term memory would be represented by proteins and RNA molecules. And its sensors would kind of be compared to extracellular and intracellular receptor proteins. And its output units would be like ribosomes, so they're transporting proteins from one cell to different cells in the localized area. And finally, I have an example of this to kind of drive the point home a little bit. We can consider the information processing output of an E. coli cell. And we have like the E. coli cell at the micro level versus its silicon equivalent. You kind of go like level by level here. You see there's more memory to be had in the biological cell versus the silicon equivalent, more processing power, for bits. It uses less power actually than a silicon equivalent. It generates a little bit less heat, which is pretty cool too. It takes less power to operate, less joules, less raw power. And it's a faster way of processing information if, we can actually fully realize it and make it fully operational bit of, computation. And all that's to say, if we have technologies like these that are fully realized, it will continue Moore's law for decades and decades to come as we are kind of approaching the limits of what silicon can do. And got some references here that'll kind of conclude my presentation.